and we're having another 2 guest speakers, but I would like to ask my friend Security to introduce the other 2 guest speakers, where they're having a valuable input in their area of service as well. Security, it's your platform.
Thank you so much, Delilah. Before I go on to introduce the 2 speakers, I do have to acknowledge others who have joined us recently. So we've got our ICC member, Bosundara Bushalji. Thank you so much for being with us today. Similarly, the NNA PASS coordinator, Sumitra Bistadidi, please, thank you so much for taking out the time and being with us. And similarly, PASS ICC member, Noresh Thapaji. I do know our New South Wales State Coordinator, Deb Gurungda, is also here. So thank you so much for taking that time to be with us this evening already. Moving ahead now, I would now like to present our next presenter, Claire Williams. Claire is the Assistant Community Education Officer for Anti-Discrimination New South Wales. The floor is all yours, Claire.
Thank you so much. I'll just to start, I'd just like to thank you for hanging on this evening just before dinner time to listen to me. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and their elders past, present and future. And I'd also like to thank Diversity Services for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. If I can just get the PowerPoint up, that would be great. If that's coming up there. Fabulous, thank you. So I'm just going to have a chat to you today about the organisation that I work for called Anti-Discrimination New South Wales. Some of you may have heard of we've recently changed our name. So we used to be called the Anti-Discrimination Board of New South Wales. And in particular, I want to have a chat to you about discrimination, what's happening at the moment with COVID-19 as well. Next slide, thanks. Yeah, so we're going to have a chat about discrimination laws, the types of unlawful discrimination that you can make a complaint about in New South Wales, how you make a complaint of discrimination and use our free service, and what's happening with COVID-19. Next slide, thanks. So what do? As a service, we actually answer inquiries about discrimination, and I'm going to give you a free telephone number, which you can call Monday to Friday to make an inquiry. We also handle complaints using a method called conciliation, which is like mediation, and we raise awareness about discrimination and its impacts. At the moment, we're particularly raising awareness about COVID-19 and what's happening. We also receive applications for exemptions from the Act. So, for example, if you are advertising for a position and you specifically wanted it to be a male or a female, you might apply for an exemption for us and say, because generally you couldn't put that in an ad. We also advise government about discrimination issues currently that are happening in the community. Next slide, thanks. So what is discrimination? So under the Anti-Discrimination Act, discrimination is treating someone unfairly because of a characteristic they have or they're assumed to have. So sometimes it's not exactly always about who you are, but it's sometimes who people think you are. So COVID-19 is a great example. We're having a lot of people who are being discriminated against, bullied and harassed because people think they may be Chinese and are falsely linking them to the COVID-19. So there's racial discrimination going on. But for example, I've worked with Korean or Filipino communities, and they have also said, people think I'm Chinese. Not that it's okay to discriminate against someone because they're Chinese. So it's who you are, but also who people assume you are, just to be clear. Next slide, thanks. So the types of discrimination, under the law, the types of discrimination are called grounds. And the grounds we cover are areas such as disability. So disability includes permanent disability or, and diseases and illnesses. That may be short-term or they may be long-term. They can be something as short-term as a cold, or they can be something or a long-term illness such as multiple sclerosis. We include sex discrimination, which includes pregnancy discrimination and breastfeeding. We include race discrimination, discriminating against someone because of their race or their ethno-religion. We include age discrimination. We include marital or domestic status discrimination, so who you are, whether you're single, married, de facto, or in a same-sex relationship. homosexual discrimination if you're gay or lesbian, transgender discrimination if you've either living as the opposite sex or you've transitioned to be the opposite sex. We also cover carers' responsibilities. And finally, we cover sexual harassment. Now, in saying that, the most common complaints we have from the New South Wales community are about race discrimination, disability discrimination, and sexual harassment. It's very important that I emphasise to you, you don't have to be an Australian citizen to make a complaint to our service, and you can be of any age. And in dealing with us, you don't have to use your own language. So you can not only ask for an interpreter when somebody calls you from our inquiry line, or you can write to us in your own language, and we provide we'll interpret that free of charge. So that's something that it's very important to reiterate. Next slide, thanks. So anti-discrimination law just doesn't cover your employment, although at the moment, because of COVID-19, we're receiving a lot of complaints specifically about employment, but also it's goods and services. So this discrimination or harassment might have happened in a shop, a bank, even in a government service. You can make a complaint about a government service, whether that be New South Wales Police or a hospital, for example, or cafes, etc. So it also includes public education where you learn. So schools, TAFEs, universities. Accommodation. So are you renting? Are you trying to get a rental accommodation? Or were you having difficulties whilst you were living in your rental accommodation? Discrimination law covers that space as well. And it also covers registered clubs. So registered clubs is any club that sells alcohol or has gambling machines. It also includes restaurants would be under goods and services, but they're included as well. Next slide, thank you. So when you make a formal complaint, we handle complaints of discrimination based on our Act, which was written in 1977. We'll try to help you and the other party. So we resolve complaints using a method called conciliation. Well, I'll explain in a minute. But complaints need to be made in writing, and I'll explain how you give us those complaints. But again, you can lodge a complaint in any language. And if you have any questions about the complaint process, you can talk to our inquiry service, which is a 1-800 number and available Monday to Friday, and I will give you that at the end of the presentation. Next slide, thank you. So we resolve things, as I mentioned, by conciliation. Conciliation is like mediation. Now, before COVID, conciliation was an opportunity for both parties to come together to discuss the complaint, and it still is, but it used to be face-to-face. But due to COVID-19, we're doing it through MS Teams, which is like online, and we're doing it through a telephone shuttling, so to protect everybody, so people actually don't have to meet. When you're making a formal complaint about another person, we'll never put you face to face with the person who's caused all the problems, the bully or the main person who's treated you. Generally, we'll put you together to resolve the complaint with the HR department of the service that you're complaining about. So we'll never put you face to face with the bully. We and our conciliation officers are impartial. We're neutral. We don't take sides. We're trying to help both parties resolve it. Next slide, thanks. So some of the outcomes might be an apology. A lot of our clients ask for an apology. They would like in saying that, we recently had a decision where it was public, had to be put in the newspaper, and then it's public. But general, our resolutions are private resolutions. They're not necessarily public. So you could ask for a letter of apology, a statement of regret, your job reinstated, your transfer or promotion, financial compensation. Now, we don't pay that. The agency you're complaining about pays that, so they have to agree to it. You might want access to a previously denied job or opportunity. Again, you might want workplace education, which is similar to what I'm doing now, but it would be focused on the area. So we would go in and do some workplace education at your workplace, or you might want to change in policy. Next slide, thanks. So we realised that specifically during COVID-19 and all throughout, even prior to COVID-19, you can use our inquiry service and not give us your details. If you decide to make a formal complaint, we have to know who you are. So it's important that we let you know that we also we collect information about incidents of discrimination using a survey monkey if you don't want to give us your details. So we're aware if you just want to let us know and you just don't want anybody to have your information, and you'll be provided with a PDF of this presentation. We do collect incidents through the Survey Monkey online. You can let us know what's happening and we'll try and resolve that. Next slide, thank you. Just some examples of unlawful discrimination that are occurring now because of COVID-19. We're receiving complaints that people's employment is terminated because they've had COVID-19, or someone in their family has COVID-19, or even sometimes people falsely think they have COVID-19. We're also receiving information that pregnant women are the first port of call in terms of they're dismissed and loses their jobs in organisations because of COVID-19, even when organisations don't have to downsize their staff financially because they've got JobKeeper and so forth. They're targeting pregnant women, which is against the law. We're also receiving information about rental agreements being terminated because people are doctors, nurse or health workers, which is against the law because the landlord's worried that they'll be infected with COVID-19 and the property will be contaminated. Next slide. Thanks. We're receiving a lot of information, and particularly when I do face-to-face community sessions, we're hearing about people who are abused in public because of their race. And Delilah and I did some information sessions recently, one with the City of Sydney, and we also did it with New South Wales Police as well, so that to educate community about CCTV cameras. Because obviously if you make a complaint to us, you actually have to tell us who's discriminating against you and bullying. And if you are targeted on the street, that's very hard to do. Okay. So race discrimination in terms of making a complaint to us does include your colour, your nationality, your descent, your ethnic and your ethno-religious background as well. We're receiving information about people who are denied access to a shop because of their race, because of COVID-19, because they're Asian background, or people assuming which race they are. And that people need to know that they have a responsibility to follow the laws and the restrictions that are in place. So, for example, we're receiving lots of complaints from people who couldn't go into pubs, clubs, restaurants because they showed their driver's licence and they were from Melbourne. People are entitled to say you can't come in at the moment because of the current restrictions. And to check those, I'm obviously not an expert on those, but check the New South Wales Health website. So we're chatting to people about why some of those things would take place. And you also have a responsibility always, and particularly during this time, not to discriminate against anyone or treat them unfairly because of their race, because you think they have COVID-19 or for any other characteristic that's protected under the law. Next slide, thank you. So just the last bit is I just want to tell you step by step carefully what you can do if you've been treated unfairly. So what's your first step? Just go to the next slide. So you can phone us. We have a 1-800 number, which I'll give you at the end of the presentation. Your call goes to an inquiry officer. Normally, because of COVID-19, unfortunately, it goes to an answering machine. But that answering machine is listened to every 45 minutes to an hour. Somebody will get back to you within a couple of hours of your call. So our service is confidential, free, and it's impartial. As a community worker, you can make an inquiry or lodge a complaint on behalf of someone else, a family member, a friend, or somebody that one of your clients. But the person who's making the complaint has to agree to that. So you can't make a complaint about someone else's situation unless they agree that they're allowing you to do that. Next slide, thanks. So once you decide, if you may just simply get information from the inquiry service and you may decide not to go further and resolve it yourself. But if you decide you want to make a complaint to us, you need to lodge it in writing. So when we say writing on our website, there's complaint forms which you can lodge, you can download, you can send us an email. You can record it on the computer and put it on a USB and you put it in Braille. You can record it on an audio cassette, on a dictaphone, but you must include as much information as possible. Next slide, thanks. So when you're complaining to us, let us know what happened. You might know who it was, who bullied you or discriminated against you or harassed you, but you might know their details, what they looked like. So times, the dates, what was the name of the organisation? Were there witnesses? You don't need witnesses to make a complaint. The full names, if you have them, of people involved, and most importantly, how would you like the complaint to be resolved? How can we fix this for you? Like, how can we resolve it? So really think, is it a letter of apology? Is it compensation? What is it that you think will make it better? Once we've received that information, we'll then let you know that we've accepted your complaint, and then we will send a letter to the other party, the organisation that you're complaining about. So the next slide, thanks. So if you go ahead and have a conciliation conference, it's a free service provided by us. As I mentioned, we're neutral. And from the minute that you send us your formal complaint to that conciliation conference, which at the moment is online, it takes on average 4 months, because we've got it back at the moment because of COVID-19. And next slide. If it's not resolved through us, it can go to the tribunal, which I'll show you on the next slide. So the tribunal, which is who handles our complaints, that's online as well at the moment. It's called NCAT. You can request your complaint to go there, but this is like a court. Its hearings are public, so you'll generally need a solicitor to use NCAT, not to use our service. Our service is free, but you'll need a solicitor to use NCAT. So you'll have to pay your own legal costs. And just the final slide, I just wanted to give you our contact information. You can see there we have a 9268 number and a 1800 number. And we also have an email. You can send us general questions to the email. I've got my contact numbers there. I do free information sessions about the law if you want to request one in my email. And if you specifically want to make a complaint, you can email us your complaint. There's the complaints down there as well. And you can follow us on our website and Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook as well. Thank you.
I think because it's quiet, Claire, I will start asking you questions.
Yes.
I think the first question is if community members have any language barriers, do you use interpreters, and who will bear the cost?
Yes. So, yes, we do use interpreters. You're able to request one, and we cover all the costs. So if you send us information in a letter about your complaint in your own language, we cover the costs of interpreting that. If we have a conciliation conference and interpreters are required, we cover the costs of that as well. So we cover the cost. It's of no cost to you, the whole service.
Okay, thank you. There is a question about the consequences of lodging a complaint to the Anti-Discrimination Board, fearing that things will worsen, especially in employment.
Yeah, that's a real question, and that's why our service is confidential. And the reason is that you resolve it confidentially with whomever, say it's at work, in your workplace. It's a confidential resolution, and if there is an impact of that, for example, just say it becomes public and members of the team in the office start talking about it, or that your confidentiality is breached, then you can make a further complaint about it to us, and that's a complaint called victimisation. So it's against the law to make your complaint public because it's a confidential thing, and it's not kept on your. And even though New South Wales government service, we keep the government can't access our complaint services. All our complaint files are confidential, just to make that very clear.
What about retaliation at the workplace if I complain about my supervisor?
Yeah, so if there's retaliation, so if that's, sometimes we find people find things become uncomfortable because someone finds out they're making a complaint. You can make a separate complaint of victimisation, which is added to your complaint, and you can ask again for compensation or what that might be because of that, and then part of the repercussions of that is the person may be dismissed, or something like that may happen because of the things becoming worse.
Okay, probably I will put you in the spot in here, Claire. What do you think the top 5 discrimination complaints for either multicultural communities or international students, if you have them in the...
Yeah, so our top complaints for international students would obviously be race discrimination. Often we have disability discrimination in terms of access to certain things, in terms of courses, the service providers not providing them the appropriate access, whether that be temporary permanent disabilities. Sexual harassment. We receive a lot of complaints about sexual harassment from employers, that some employers target international students thinking that they don't know about the law, and then therefore sexual harassment takes place. So I've done sessions at universities and heard that a great deal from students. And what would be age discrimination as well in terms of employment. So starting somewhere, working somewhere with their part-time employment, things like not getting people but stopping paying them illegally. Also people giving them the incorrect, like the revolting jobs to do, but someone their same age is not given those inappropriate jobs. So things like that. Yeah, that would be my answer to that.
Thanks, Claire. Appreciate it. If you have any question, please send us through. We'll flick them to Claire and we will share her information. Security, back to you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you so much, Claire. That was really informative session for us to have, and thank you for sharing the presentation and mainly the examples that you showed to kind of highlight to us what are the different sorts of discrimination that you've been seeing, come across your doors. So that'll help us to identify whether or not it can be classified as a discrimination from our end as well as showing us the detailed process of how to go about making a complaint should we have to go down that path. So once again, thank you so much. It was really informative. Now, moving on to our next presentation, and I must say this is the last presentation, and I do appreciate each and everyone giving your time. I would like to present our next presenter, who's Alexandra Alavania, if I got that correct. She is the Senior Policy Officer with the Diversity Services Department of Communities and Justice. So, Alexandra, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Security. Thank you for that warm welcome. Thank you, everybody. I will try to be very quick. I'm very conscious of the time, and I appreciate that you're all here with me this evening. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the original inhabitants of the actual Liverpool local government area. So they are the Darug, the Gandangara, and the Tharawal Aboriginal people, and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all working and we meet today. As you know, my name's Alex. I work for the Department of Communities and Justice in Diversity Services, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about fines and the impact of COVID-19 on multicultural and vulnerable communities. I want to talk a little bit about the fine space, the WDO scheme, which I believe can support vulnerable people with fines. Deirdre, if you could bring up the next slide, please. So what am I covering this evening? We're going to talk a little bit about an overview of what fines are and what is a WDO, the impact of fines on vulnerable communities, setting up and managing a WDO or setting up and managing your fines, other resources, any contacts for help, and obviously a bit of a question and answer session at the end. Next slide, please, Deirdre. So, what is the impact of an unpaid fine? For people, accumulating fines debt is often a result of multiple factors. They have a range of other competing debts, and there is a lot of difficulty in the choices about what to pay. Their understanding is limited in relation to the fines enforcement system, so getting a fine can be quite a confusing or a daunting issue. The person may be engaging in risky or reckless or self-destructive behaviours due to mental illness, addiction, and other behavioural disorders, as we heard earlier in the evening. There's ignorance or misinformation about the debt recovery process, especially if you're a young person. You often think that you can just ignore a fine. There's a fear of Revenue New South Wales or a fear of the debt collection agencies and the New South Wales Police, so people are likely to go into hiding. It could be the result of unstable accommodation. So you may receive a fine at an old address, or you're couch surfing, or you don't have permanent residence. And add now into the mix the pandemic, and the impact of fines is exacerbated, particularly when we're faced with navigating the new Public Health Order Act and the conditions of the Act, which are very confusing and often changing, particularly for multicultural communities and communities that don't speak, where English is not a first language. Fines, we know, impact vulnerable people differently, especially when compared to people who have capacity to pay. So, for example, under the current Public Health Order Act, receiving a fine if you're an international student and you've lost your job due to COVID-19 would have an excessive impact, a disproportionate impact on you when compared to someone who is in a relatively stable financial circumstance and is still earning quite a significant income. Next slide, please. So what are the types of fines that I'm talking about? There are 3 types of penalty notices or fines that people get in New South Wales. There are court fines, which money that the court can decide that you have to pay as a punishment for a crime or an offence that you've committed. They're initially paid directly to the court, but they are enforced through Revenue New South Wales if you fail to pay them. There are penalty notices, which are mostly issued by police or transit officers. You'll get council rangers and other regulatory officers that have capacity to hand out these fines for a range of different offences, including driving offences, parking fines, not voting or failing to appear as a jury member, or if you're walking your dog in the park and they're not on the leash, or you don't have a valid train ticket, or you've got your feet up on the train seat, or you're not wearing a bicycle helmet. So there are a few of the offences that you can attract a penalty notice for in New South Wales. In New South Wales, there are over 10,000 offences that you can commit where you can be issued with a fine. And then there are victims' restitution orders, which often happens when a person lodges a compensation claim against another person where they've been a victim of violence, and the compensation order is issued by Victim Services. The person who has been the offender of that crime is served with the victim's restitution order, and they're ordered to pay that debt through the court and to the victim. Originally, the debt was collected by Victim Services, but Revenue New South Wales is a much better avenue or debt collection agency for the state. So those debts have been transferred over to Revenue New South Wales. But what we're going to specifically focus on today are really those penalty notice fines, and they obviously, that's where our COVID-19, our pandemic public health order fines would be issued under. Next slide, please. So this is basically what the fine cycle looks like. You'll get a penalty notice, and then you'll have a reminder notice and a final notice for payment. So once you're issued with the fine, you get the penalty notice, which is often either something in the mail or a slip under your windscreen in your car, and it's an on-the-spot fine. There's initially a 21-day period where you can challenge the fine. After the 21 days, you'll receive a penalty reminder notice, which provides you with further 28 days to pay the fine or challenge the fine. Now, after these 7 weeks, the fine will go into enforcement, and it becomes an overdue or a pay now fine. Revenue New South Wales then has a number of enforcement options they can apply to you to get that fine back. So next slide, please, Deirdre. So what can you do? The first thing that I would recommend is to never ignore a fine. If you get a fine in New South Wales, there are a number of things you can do. You can accept the fine, you can pay the fine in full or by instalments, you can challenge the fine, and that has a number of steps, which means you can review the fine or challenge the fine in court or apply to have the fine written off. Often these steps require you to get some kind of legal support. I wouldn't recommend you challenging a fine or applying for a write-off or having the fine reviewed without support, without some kind of advocacy in relation to that, in relation to supporting you. The most important thing is to have your fines under management, and you can do that by setting up a payment plan or checking if you are eligible to undertake a WDO. Now, to be able to undertake a WDO or to enter into a payment plan, you have to move into what we call voluntary enforcement. So when you come, in terms of voluntary enforcement, this assists people with their fines. It means that you skip all of that 7-week process, and you're automatically enforcing your fine yourself, and you're putting yourself in a position where you're able to put your fine into management or a management plan. And this is where a payment plan or a WDO can be set up. When you voluntarily enforce a fine, you stop any extra fees being added to that fine. Next slide, please, Deirdre. So often, what happens when you ignore a fine is these are the additional costs that are imposed when you ignore that fine, and when you let that fine go through that process of being overdue and being under a final notice. So the example I have here is, if you're a young international student and you've received a fine, say for riding on the train without a valid ticket or an Opal card, or your Opal card is low on credit, that is an on-the-spot fine of $200. Now, as a young person, let's say you take no action for those first 7 weeks, Revenue New South Wales will automatically add an additional $65 to your fine when it becomes an enforcement order, and then an additional $40 to suspend your driver's license. Because if you ignore a fine and it goes into enforcement, one of those sanctions that Revenue New South Wales can impose is a cancellation of your driver's license. So for that one fine, it's already jumped up to $305. So it's really important that you don't ignore the fine. Next slide, please. So what happens if you don't pay the fine? Revenue New South Wales will apply progressive enforcement actions, usually starting with licence suspension or registration cancellation. This can then lead to more serious civil sanctions, which include a garnish sheet order, which is where the government Revenue New South Wales can take money directly out of your bank account, a property seizure order, which involves the Sheriff of New South Wales, an examination summons, which would rely on you going to court and declaring what you own, or if you do own any property in New South Wales, a charge on land. So you won't be able to sell your property until the fine has been dealt with. There's also obviously additional fees. The system is highly mechanical, and the actions are highly effective for most people that can afford to pay a fine or afford to navigate the system. But unfortunately, they have a disproportionate effect on people who are disadvantaged. So what is the impact of all of this? Next slide, please, Deirdre. What the impact is you potentially may be eligible for a work and development order. So a work and development order allows eligible people to clear fines through unpaid work, through courses, counselling, and other treatment. WDOs are completely voluntary. It's not a court order. It's not an order issued by the government. It's an order of work that you yourself or your sponsor would engage you through. Next slide, please. The WDO scheme is an example of co-design and collaboration between government, community, health, and private sectors to deliver real community benefit to the people of New South Wales. It was implemented in 2009 in partnership with Department of Communities and Justice and Revenue New South Wales, and was made permanent in 2011. Was governed by a monitoring committee, which comprised mostly of health professionals and corrective services. Chaired by the Department of Communities and Justice, it was utilised to steer and monitor the scheme's early implementation and expansion. Now, as a result of our success in our pilot from 2009 to 2011, the scheme was expanded and a governance group was established to provide a mechanism to lead and develop the scheme and to broaden the scheme across New South Wales. The members are committed to meeting every 2 months, and since its inception, it's generated more than 2,500 sponsors that are supporting more than 100,000 clients access services to be able to pay down debt. The scheme partners have one common goal, and that's to ensure the integrity of the scheme while delivering an alternative fine resolution process for vulnerable communities and their advocates in New South Wales. Next slide, please. So there are 3 important things that I want you to remember about a work and development order. 1 is eligible debt, 2 are eligible clients, and 3 are eligible activities. So the first criteria, the client needs to have an eligible debt to be able to do a work and development order. The eligible debts are a penalty notice or court fine, or a victim's restitution order. Fines also need to be issued in New South Wales. If they are issued by another interstate agency, then the client cannot do a WDO. If the client has moved interstate, there are some interstate WDO sponsors who can assist. If the client is here on a temporary visa, an international student, but currently living in New South Wales and has a New South Wales fine, they are eligible to undertake a work and development order. The second criteria, so next slide, is an eligible person. So who is eligible to do a WDO? Any person, including a child, any adult can undertake a WDO as long as they meet one of the 6 eligibility criteria as outlined in our guidelines. And just briefly, a person can apply if they're under the age of 18, are experiencing economic hardship, including but not limited to anyone on a Centrelink benefit, are homeless, have a mental illness, have an intellectual disability or cognitive impairment, or a serious addiction to drugs, alcohol, and volatile substances. You do not need to satisfy all 6 criteria. You have to at least satisfy 1. So if you click through the slide deck, Deirdre, that'll bring up all the options on that slide deck. Thank you. So next slide. And the last one, the third criteria, is an eligible activity. So what are WDO activities? There are 6 types of activities that can be undertaken with WDO sponsors. Each activity has a different value you can see on the screen. Each sponsor is approved to undertake some or all of these activities. Note, educational or vocational life skills courses are undertaken by TAFE New South Wales. So if you're an international student undertaking a course at TAFE New South Wales, you may be eligible to ensure that your course counts towards a WDO. A person can only have one WDO open at a time and can do a combination of activities to work off a maximum of $1,000 per month off their fine debt. It is the responsibility of the WDO sponsor to ensure that activities proposed to be undertaken are suitable and appropriate for the client. It is also the responsibility of the sponsor to report on the hours completed each month using the Revenue Self-Service Portal. Next slide, please. Now we're going to watch a short video. You'll get to hear from participants who have completed a work and development order activity and who have been sponsored by a work and development order sponsor. And you'll get to hear about their journey through the scheme and how the scheme has helped support them in management of fines.
I think I was out of jail 12 months before I come here, you know, and I was definitely heading back there again if I didn't do something. I'd accumulated $15,000 worth of state debt, and I was a 50-year-old man, retired drug addict with absolutely no skills. Who was going to employ me? Who was going to give me a chance of having a go at life?
You know, I walked in the place and I had sort of no will and I had no hope, and you know, I was that down and out. I've sort of done that to myself. Yeah, I did have a debt, something like $16,000. I know it was a lot of pressure on myself. I was, flat out at work, and and I just had a bit of a drinking problem that sort of got out of hand.
I'm free today, you know. I'm free. I don't owe any money. I don't owe the government nothing, and now I'm a tax-paying citizen.
I got my spirit back. I got my my will back. I got my life back, and all in 7 months, just all the tools and that I've learnt, and just how to live and how to think.
You're welcome.
I've done anger management. I've done grief counselling. I've done financial counselling. Hey Dad program. It just helps you to be a better father.
Today I pay my rent and buy my own food. I'm an active member of society, and it's the most beautiful thing.
Next slide, please. And how you can help. So if you are supporting a vulnerable person, I want to leave you with a few things. Firstly, I want you to know that you can become an advocate with Revenue New South Wales. An advocate can speak on behalf of their clients, helping them navigate the fine enforcement system. So if you have a client that you know has received a fine, then you can contact Revenue New South Wales with your client next to you, and you can apply to become an advocate, and you can continue to liaise with Revenue New South Wales as their advocate in relation to that. Both Legal Aid and Revenue New South Wales are our scheme partners and are here to help you. If you need any assistance with fines, particularly under the current public health orders in relation to your rights and access to support, we encourage you to call these agencies. If you are working with the client and they have a fine, please explain the consequences of not dealing with a fine. Keep WDO in mind. As a client, you can find a local sponsor by contacting the WDO Legal Aid Service. If you are an agency and are already supporting vulnerable people in your community, then I would encourage you to become a WDO sponsor. If you would like to know more about this, please do not hesitate to contact our program organisers. Dalila's details are on the flyer following this presentation, and we will ensure to have more information to you about how to become a WDO sponsor. It is really an easy process, and if you're already undertaking work with a client, whether it be supporting them through counselling or any case management activity, if they're doing voluntary work for your service, they are all activities that are eligible under a WDO that can repay that debt. Alternatively, we would encourage you and appreciate it if you could display our posters of flyers in your organisation and service centres. There are a few contacts there on that slide deck with regard to our project partners, obviously Diversity Services, the Legal Aid WDO service, and the Revenue New South Wales WDO hotline service. They're all really vital contacts for you in relation to any information you require in relation to fines and WDOs. And lastly, I'm happy to take any questions from the group. And thank you again for your time. I hope I was able to do that very quickly for you so you can get to having some dinner with your families.
Thank you so much, Claire. I believe Sam is keeping an eye on the chat box for any questions.
Yes.
And do we have some?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alex, for the presentation. And
No
this
problem.
is an invite for all of you. Like, it's not only to access WDO, but also to become a sponsor yourself and help reach out to your clients, because you know the community better than us. But Alex, a few questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
Does an unpaid fine affect the credit rating of the individuals? And I will say as well, does it affect their visa status?
I don't believe it can affect their visa status. But in terms of the credit rating, maybe it may. I should probably. I will say I'm not legally qualified to answer that question. That's something that our legal aid service can definitely do. It should not affect their visa status unless they're undertaking work or they've got a specific conditions to their visa. And if they were to undertake a WDO, they'd have to be mindful that that doesn't conflict with any conditions of the visa. But in terms of the fine itself, I don't think there's anything that would be pertained in terms of a regulatory fine that would have any impact on someone's visa.
A tricky question, though.
Yeah.
Do you think international students will be eligible for the WDO?
Absolutely, yes. International students, if they were to undertake, say, voluntary work, in addition to their studies that wouldn't impact any conditions of their visa. If they had a suitable sponsor, could absolutely undertake a WDO.
Okay.
Yeah.
If the debt is unpaid for a while and has got escalated to the debt recovery, can this also be referred to WDO?
Yes, it can. Yes. So what happens, the debt has to, when we talk about that debt escalation and enforcement, that's what happens when you ignore the fine. But if you were to get a fine and you were to ring revenue, or your advocate were to ring revenue and say, I want to enforce this fine myself, I want to voluntarily enforce this fine, it means you miss all of those steps of the enforcement phase, and then your options are open to you to pay that fine off via a payment plan, or enter into a WDO on that fine. So absolutely, even if it escalates right through and to a license cancellation, you can access the scheme.
Okay, I have a lot of questions, but I'm cautious of the time, so I'll give back to you, Scott and Delilah. Thank you. Thanks, Alex.
That's okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sam. And once again, thank you so much, Alex, for your presentation. In this uncertain, what we are facing at the moment, and added fine will definitely add on to the stress. So one clear message that we can get out is never fine. There are ways we can addressing it, but to never ignore it. So thank you once again. Now that does bring us into our presentation. So now I would like to request my NNA National Coordinator, Sandhya, to please come and give a vote of thanks.
Respected Ms. Drupada Sapkotaji, Consular of Embassy of Nepal, Canberra, NRNA ICC Vice President Anakesiju, NRNA President Kesab Kodelju, guest speakers Ranju Agli Thapaju, Thoshi, Bandana Kharkiju, Kalari William, Alexandra, and NRNA Narini Kunja Australia team, NCC, NRNA team, SCC. I, on behalf of NRNA Women Forum, Narini Kunja Australia, would like to express my sincere gratitude and heartiest appreciation for your valuable time. Year 2020 has been a challenging year for human and humanity due to COVID-19 pandemic, and it is undeniable that many of us are impacted by unprecedented emergency and situation out of their control. However, there are a special group of people who are away from their home countries in search of better life in future, like international students in Australia. They comprise almost 10% of population according to the recent census. Amongst them are the women, who are in the most vulnerable condition due to employment and lack of skill, especially who have arrived in Australia after 2019. We all know well how hard and struggling the early days in Australia. Away from home and family, despite having good friends and close family members here, it's like everyone for themselves. And if you are a woman, then the problem are more than double, as you are more likely to get harassed, abused, dominated at any place, including residence, public transport, and workplace where you go for trial or for work. During the early days, due to lack of self-confidence, local culture rules and rights, and lack of skill. And now the COVID-19 situation has put them on more risky condition than ever. They might need mental assistance and community support to build their confidence. Hope our student will be able to collect as much as information from our speakers. We on behalf of the organization will continue this type of program in the future to aware the community at large. Lastly, I would like to thank you all for the support, especially NNA team, who worked hard tirelessly to make this event successful. I'm really proud of my team. Thank you again to the media supporter and associate individual for making this program great successful. A special thanks to Community Liaison Officer Dilela Sinke. Thank you, Dilela, for your great effort to make this program great successful. And also, thanks to our guest speaker, Ranju Agli Thapaju, CEO of Sydney City College of Management, and she's also founder president of NNA. Toshi Koche, NSW Treasury, Vandana Karkiju, mental health clinician, Census Community Mental Health, Clearly William, Assistant Community Education Officer from Anti-Discrimination NSW, Alexandria Alvange, Department of Community and Justice. Thank you so much for your great presentation, and thank you all for listening. Have a great weekend. Stay safe. Thank you so much. Namaste.
Thank you so much, Sandhya, for your kind words and encouraging words. Now, we have come to the end of this wonderful webinar. And before we end, I do want to let you all know that we will be sending out a survey that will come to your email. If you could please respond to the survey, that will only help us in coming up with more initiatives that are really the need of what the community needs. Now, before we end, I would like to thank all of our presenters today. It would not be possible without you participating here, so thank you from the bottom of my heart. Also, the organizers of the webinar. I cannot thank Delilah enough for all the work that she does, all the partnership that she does. I don't know what we would do without you, Delilah. Thank you so much for your support all the time. And likely Deirdre and Sam, thank you so much, both of you. You've really helped us, and Deirdre, with you trying to figure out all this so we can make this possible. The technical side of things, cannot thank you enough as well. And Sam, you've been a great help today, keeping in touch of all of the questions and making it very engaging for our presenters and our participants as well. Now, finally, I would like to thank my Nadi Nikunja Australia team, who have time and again shown that we are a group of dedicated women, you know, who are always willing to work together for our ongoing commitment to our community. It is the support and dedication that we get from within the team that is an inspiration, so we can always come up with more on, you know, initiatives that aims to bring about a positive outcome for the community. So thank you, team. You know, I do call ourselves the A team, and I think we deserve a pat on the back for coming up with such a great incentive. Once again, thank you all. Now, I would like to end the evening. I know we all are running out of time. I hope we all walk away from this being a little bit more informed so we can do our jobs to support the community and listen to where it's needed. Thank you all. I want you all to stay safe, stay positive. Namaste.